Susan Clancy is no stranger to controversy. The Harvard-trained psychologist created a firestorm in 2003 when her book Abducted debunked the widely accepted idea of repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse. Her latest book, The Trauma Myth, has aroused an even more passionate outcry. In it, Dr. Clancy accuses the current medical and child advocacy communities of misrepresenting the way in which sexual abuse of children most often occurs, which is at the hand of family members or close friends rather than by violent strangers. It's published by Basic Books, and I'm very pleased that it brings Susan Clancy to our show today. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Are you arguing that as a society we've spent the past 30 years skirting around the true nature of childhood sexual abuse?
Well, I think that's an excellent synopsis of how I feel. That was better said than I could have.
But there's a problem here, isn't there, in that statistics are hard to come by because sexual abuse often goes unreported.
That's exactly right. Most of what we read and hear about sexual abuse involves very unusual cases, the type of cases that come to the attention of police and medical professionals. Most cases go unreported.
The cases that come to the police and medical professionals generally involve violence, but you say that's very rare.
It is very rare. So generally, if the parents find out about it or if police find out about it, it's because there were some signs or symptoms that the abuse occurred. In most cases, there are none, and children tend to keep it quiet.
But do professionals in the field know that violence is just a rare part of this whole thing? Why are there so many of the programs designed to prevent abuse and treat children who've been sexually abused aimed at cases that involve violence?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. I think I'm not saying professionals don't know the truth about sexual abuse, meaning that in most cases, children are not traumatized when it happens. They tend to be confused. They're kids. They don't understand the sexual nature of what's going on, etc. I think many professionals are aware of that, but there is a sort of unspoken rule. You don't talk about that, because if you downplay the fear and terror and horror aspect of sexual abuse, people have an automatic tendency to say, oh, you're saying it doesn't damage the child, or you're saying it's not a big deal.
That you're condoning it.
Exactly.
And you're not doing either of those.
No,
although,
I think it's an atrocious crime, and I am fully committed to doing anything I can to prevent it.
And it's interesting that one of the responses to the book on Amazon is that you're a pedophile.
It's so awful. I can't read my Amazon reviews. But I do have to say, for anybody out there, I think that anybody that wrote those reviews hasn't actually read the book, because I hope it's clear by the book I am a tremendous advocate and highly committed to reducing the prevalence of this to-date horrific crime.
What is your estimate of how many children are sexually abused each year?
Well, based on national data, so this is random sample, excellent data, it's about 1 in 5 women in the United States was sexually touched by an adult before they hit puberty, and about 1 in 8 men.
1 in 5. That's an awful lot of women.
That's an awful lot of people. That tells you how common this crime is, and based on recent epidemiological work internationally, these rates are pretty common all over. And based on work from University of Chicago, these rates have been as high for decades. So there's no sign it's really increasing or decreasing.
Now, this book grows out of research that you did as a graduate student where you interviewed adults who'd been sexually abused as children. Didn't those interviews lead you to some surprising conclusions about how traumatic the abuse had been for the children at the time that it happened, and at the time that it happened is a key factor here?
It was shocking and disturbing because it ran so counter to what I was being trained to think.
And what you expected to find.
Exactly. I was doing work on the long-term impact of trauma, and I was trying to understand how traumatic it was when it happened so that I could see if there was a relationship between how damaged people were later on in life. And what they were telling me is at the time it happened, there was very little actual fear, terror, or horror.
Weren't you also surprised by how many people told you that they weren't even sure whether they'd been sexually abused?
Oh, my God. That would be so awful. People would call and say, I think I'd like to participate in your study, but I'm not sure I was sexually abused.
That's because they hadn't resisted the abuser?
Yes. I would say, well, what happened? And they say, well, when I was 12, my stepfather molested me and involved oral sex. And I would be thinking, how could you not think you were sexually abused? And it would come down to the fact that they didn't resist it. And they understood that sexual abuse was something violent and against the child's will. And at the time, they said they were confused and they trusted the person and they let it happen.
Well, we understand that we can't expect children to resist the advances of adults. There's a power imbalance there. Children are told to respect adults, to listen to what they say, and also if they're young, they probably can't even understand what's going on.
And I couldn't agree with you more. It's just heartbreaking. I mean, you have these children, and they're being taken advantage of by people that they trust and love, and most children are not able to understand sexually toned counters or the meaning of sex. So it's a complicated dynamics, and I do not think that they are going to be capable of handling that type of situation.
I remember years ago a child who obviously needed a lot of attention, and she actually did sexually flirtatious things. I think she was 6 or 7 years old, and I thought, oh boy, this kid's going to have some trouble down the line. But often the victims of this are kids who are underpraised and who feel deprived.
Well, I mean, I don't know if the data would suggest that's often the case, but David Finkelhor has a wonderful new book out where he argues that any type of violence against children or any type of abuse of children is likely to happen when the children are being neglected. And that kind of neglect can come from being emotionally neglected or physically neglected. Those are kids that tend to need more attention or look for it. So, you might be right.
Susan A. Clancy is my guest. Her book, The Trauma Myth, The Truth About the Sexual Abuse of Children and Its Aftermath, which is published by Basic Books. And you've said you would have preferred a different title?
No. I don't know if I can say anything bad about Basic Books. The title has been
a huge... selling title.
Well, I don't know. I should have changed the title. It should not have been this title. It's attracted tremendous controversy. People are automatically assuming I'm saying that sexual abuse doesn't damage victims. I'm not. I'm saying even though when it happens, it can be a confusing and ambiguous experience, later on in life, victims can be devastated. And they often report guilt and shame and isolation, and those are reasons they keep it quiet. And it's heartbreaking. So it was a misleading title.
And they come to those feelings later in life because they learn more about what happened, the implications of what had happened to them when they were younger.
Exactly. You have these children, and often they hit puberty or a little after, and they come to understand the sexual nature of what happened. They learn that they were sexually betrayed by people that they trust. And what's terrible is that instead of being outraged, many of them bring the anger inwards, and they feel, why did I let it happen? There must be something wrong with me. I didn't say no. Why did I continue to love this person? And it's terrible that the victims feel this way, because under the circumstances, how they reacted is perfectly normal and understandable.
I've often heard that people who are sexually abused are likely to go on and abuse people when they become adults. You don't deal with that in this book.
No, and you know what? I'd like to sort of stay away from that, but that's a commonly held belief. But the data they're kind of equivocal about whether in fact that is the case.
One of the people you interviewed said that she wished she'd been injured so she would have been forced to come forward at the time and been spared years of suffering in silence.
A number of people said that they would say horrible things like, I wish it had been bloody or violent because then at least I would have known that it wasn't my fault.
Why do you think so many people are outraged by this book? Because you said you're not reading the Amazon.com responses, right. But there are people out there who are writing about you as though you are, I guess, one of the most evil people in the world.
Yes, and those people tend to be experts in the field of trauma. The victim support has been incredibly reassuring for me and has made this time less difficult. I've received a lot of supportive emails from victims, but I think the outpouring of anger has to do, one, the title, which is misleading, and two, the fact that many people seem to believe that if you say sexual abuse is not a terrifying, horrific experience for most victims, that you are either implicitly or explicitly saying sexual abuse is not a big deal. And I think that is very wrong.
Well, although you've repeatedly said that children are never to blame for their abuse, doesn't your finding that children usually don't resist their abusers make many healthcare professionals and children's advocates uncomfortable?
Yes, hugely uncomfortable. And that is the reason why in the 1960s and 1970s sexual abuse started to get framed, in part mostly by feminists, as a physical assault, because that sort of made it seem less that it was the child's fault or that the child was involved.